single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making yet another stand.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Chantel Destra. New York State lawmakers made their way back to the state capitol to officially start the new legislative session. And it was a busy week for state leaders. During his remarks in the Assembly chamber, Speaker Carl Heastie touted past accomplishments of the legislature. The Speaker then sounded the alarm on how federal cuts are actively impacting New York. In the upper chamber, State Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins shared a similar sentiment while emphasizing the chamber's commitment to addressing affordability. Meanwhile, Governor Kathy Hochul spent the week unveiling several proposals from her State of the State address scheduled for next week. One proposal focused on protecting students from online threats. The second proposal is meant to address the rising threat of 3D printed and illegal firearms. And the third proposal would implement universal childcare across the state. When asked about her mindset for the new year, the governor told reporters that she was feeling strong while navigating the impact of federal policies.
We've been through a lot. And I would say we've been battle tested to deal with any of the trials and tribulations that come our way. For example, for a solid year, we've had to deal with incoming from Washington.
And apart from it being a new legislative session, this week also marked the 5th anniversary of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. In this next segment, we sat down with State Senator John Liu, who sponsors a bill that would require public schools across the state to teach students about the history of that attack. Here's that conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Senator.
It's always good to be on with you.
Now, what can you tell us about the bill that you sponsor that would require New York schools to teach students about the history of January 6, 2021?
It's a bill that Assemblymember Charles Levine and I have introduced into the state legislature, a bill that would require the teaching of the January 6th insurrection for all New York State public school kids. This was a really important event, if we can call it that, in our nation's history. Not since 1812, over 200 years ago, had there been an attack on our nation's capital. And it is something that cannot be whitewashed or, gaslit, because if you listen to the words of the president over these last several months, up to a year, he's almost pretended that nothing happened. A lot happened on January 6, 2021. People rioted. They set things on fire. There was substantial damage to the state capitol, not to mention people dying in that insurrection. And so I remember being so frightened seeing what was happening on TV that day 5 years ago. And it's something that we cannot allow anybody, including the president, to basically try to change or rewrite history as if it didn't happen. So it's important that our kids are taught about what happened on January 6th.
And can you tell us about what prompted you to take the step to introduce this bill? What are you hoping its long-term impact will be?
What prompted me is the horrific memories and citing of what happened on January 6th. And as we led up to the 5th year, the 5th anniversary, seeing the president continue to deny what actually happened. In fact, one of the first steps that he took upon being sworn in for his second term was to issue a blanket pardon to over 1,000 people who were arrested on a range of violent charges. And so that's what prompted it. And what am I hoping? It's like this is January 6, 2021 is a pivotal moment in American history that cannot be forgotten, because when history is forgotten, it becomes prone to repeat. And we certainly, I don't think anybody wants to see a repeat of what happened on January 6, 2021. It's bad for democracy. It's a terrible stain on what this democracy has stood for.
And how will you overcome some of the opposition that might come with this bill, possibly from Republican members in the legislature? How will you be willing to work with members across the aisle to get the bill passed and signed into law?
Well, I always want to work across the aisle. I mean, we want support for this from anybody. And I think most people understood what happened on January 6th. I've spoken with my Democratic colleagues, my Republican colleagues about how significant January 6th is. And teaching our kids, I don't prescribe exactly how to teach. I leave it up to the state education department, our teachers, and the historians to chronicle exactly what happened. And I'm sure there will be different perspectives and views on that day and the ramifications, and all of that should be taught to our school kids. But this is a day that should not be forgotten by school kids or anybody else.
And can you tell us more about what the role of the state education department and or local school boards will be to ensure that the history is being taught in the most effective and accurate way?
Well, this bill adds the January 6th insurrection to what is a very short list of historical events that must be taught to New York school kids. The Holocaust, slavery, and the Irish potato famine being really just on the very short list of historical events. So the January 6th insurrection would be taught in the same way. The state education department would promulgate materials and ensure that local school districts, whether it be New York City or Buffalo or everywhere in between, are actually teaching our kids.
And have you had any conversations with parents or school officials about this bill? And if so, what are those conversations like?
Well, school parents certainly want their kids to be taught the full history without any kind of euphemisms or the real history. And again, it's so that people understand, their kids understand what's happened in history and what the ramifications might be for the future, and to avoid these kinds of terrible events. School officials, I understand they generally don't like legislators to be imposing these kinds of requirements. They often feel that they know what's important, and that is for the most part true. But in this case, the January 6th insurrection just rises to the level of we need to have uniformity and consistency across the state. And that's why this legislation is proposed.
And are there any costs associated with implementing and monitoring this legislation, either to schools, the state, or school districts?
I don't foresee substantial costs. Obviously, with any kind of action, there is some nominal cost involved. But the reality is that the state education department and all the local school districts are already subject to that short list of historical events that I mentioned earlier that are required to be taught to New York school kids. And so adding this event in history should not be of any significant cost.
And with the start of a new legislative session at the state capitol, how will you work to garner support for the bill so that it gets passed and doesn't get overlooked in the many priorities that take up the legislative session?
Well, we definitely are going to have a doozy of a legislative session in 2026, especially what's happening with the federal government and what we need to do to protect fellow New Yorkers. But that's true every year where there are many, many different priorities coming into the opening of the legislative session. I'm going to do my best to impart the importance of this particular bill and garner support from my colleagues to get it passed and then ultimately signed by the governor.
And what are you hearing from your Assembly counterpart, Assemblymember Charles Levine, who sponsors the bill in the lower chamber, about his plans to garner support in that chamber?
Oh, I know Assemblymember Levine is already working his colleagues, and I have to give credit to him because Assemblymember Levine is the one that brought the bill to my attention, and I agreed wholeheartedly to carry it in the Senate.
And lastly, as chair of the Senate Education Committee, what are some of your other top legislative priorities that you're hoping to make movement on this session?
Senator Shelley Mayer from Westchester chairs the larger education committee that deals with the 700 plus school districts throughout the state of New York. As as the chairperson of the New York City Education Committee, we clearly have many different priorities. This year, we've got a new mayor of New York City. He has already described some of his priorities. The issue of school governance slash mayoral control is up for once again deliberation and passage this year. We also have the matter of classrooms being overcrowded in New York City, much more so than the rest of the state. So we have to work with the new mayor to reduce class sizes in the city of New York. And then, of course, statewide, which affects New York City, but also the rest of the state. We have some of the changes that the White House has imposed on the state of New York, affecting our education for our kids, as well as some of the federal funding that's coming through, particularly with regard to educating kids with special needs. So we've got our plate full on the education buffet, as well as on a number of other issues.
That is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for taking the time to connect with us today, Senator.
I hope to connect again with you very soon.
And we were speaking with State Senator John Liu, chair of the Senate New York City Education Committee and representing the 16th State Senate District. And another top priority for state lawmakers this year is to address the cost of prescription drugs for New Yorkers. Assemblymember John McDonald carries several bills to address this issue that he hopes will make it over the legislative finish line this year. Our Elise Klein spoke with the Assembly member to learn more.
Thank you so much for joining us, Assembly Member.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So first, can you help us understand what prescription affordability looks like in the state and what are your biggest concerns?
I say prescription affordability is a very complex issue. There's a lot of different, from patient's perspective, a lot depends on what plan they participate in, what they've chosen, and it gets extremely complicated. Just New York State alone, we are very generous in this state, or we've been generous in this state, where in many circumstances we provide expanded health insurance coverage, which includes prescription drug coverage up to 400% of the annual family income. That may change because of the impacts of HR 1, but people get to choose different plans. And we as a pharmacy, and not as a legislator, but as a pharmacy, we try to help guide patients to the navigators out there to help them really choose the program that's going to work well for them. Part of the challenge is the pharmaceutical industry, and everyone likes to talk about big bad pharma, although they don't mind it when they come out with these medications that actually make a difference. The pharmaceutical benefit has actually, I'm starting to believe, become either a revenue or profit center for certain entities. There's a 340B benefit, which is a federally ordained program, which basically healthcare systems rely on dramatically. Hospitals are very concerned about some of the changes, where they get the drug at a deep discount, but get paid by the commercial health plans at very, very handsome rates. And these are usually very expensive drugs. The reality is the public doesn't know it. They have no idea. There's probably 3 people in the state of New York that actually understand the 340B program, but I can tell you every hospital administrator and every HQHC is very much concerned. But the other dynamic that's been playing out for about a decade or two that pharmacies see, and pharmacies have kind of been in the crosshairs of this whole thing, is the major manufacturers, in order for their products to be covered, are required to provide significant discounts in the form of rebates to the PBMs, who nobody really knows what a PBM is. It's a pharmaceutical benefit manager. There's only 3 major ones in the country. And then the question is, what happens to that rebate? We're told that it gets handed down to the health plan and therefore lowers patients' costs. But the reality is, I haven't met a patient yet who's told me their prices are getting lower; they're only getting higher. And that was one of the efforts that the governor put forth in the budget last year, was to require the PBMs and the manufacturers to provide to the Department of Financial Services for commercial health plans exactly what the rebates are. Because in all fairness, as much as I can tell you from following the industry nationally, the rebates in many circumstances are up to 50% of the true cost of the drug. And that's a lot. When you think about this GLP-1s, everyone's saying they're expensive, and they are. But when they cost $1,000 a month and there's a $500 rebate going back to either the plan or the PBM, it gets a little bit gray. And one of the things that I've always pushed for a long period of time is transparency. Business owners, which are payers of insurance bills, insurance plans, which some are associated with the PBM, some are not, patients, all should know what their drug truly costs. The other item that I'm pushing this year, I pushed last year, passed in the Senate, is actually to take pharmacies themselves. We're the front line. We're the ones who are really working with the patients the most. We try to find and help guide them to options to afford their prescriptions, because if they can't afford their prescriptions, they're not going to get their prescriptions. If they don't get their prescriptions, their ailment, their condition is not going to improve. And that's what, as healthcare professionals, pharmacists are focusing on. Unfortunately, the PBMs have negotiated very aggressive contracts with all pharmacies. And by the way, they'll pay pharmacy A1 this price, pharmacy 2 this price, pharmacy this price. There's no rhyme or reason, unless the PBM, who owns their own pharmacies, sometimes pays their own pharmacies more than they pay their competitors. So what we're trying to do is to move to what New York State Medicaid moved to a couple of years ago, which is basically using a national benchmark for reimbursement plus a dispensing fee. And it's applicable to an independent pharmacy or a 1,000-store chain. Doesn't matter who it is. It's the same reimbursement all the time. Why are we pushing for that? To give greater transparency on exactly what the true payment of the drugs are, at least from what's getting to the patient's hands.
So you brought up transparency. I know there are several policy measures that go through the legislative session each year, one of which was recently vetoed for the second time, related to hospital closure notice. I'm wondering, what was your reaction to this veto, and what would this bill have accomplished?
The hospital closure notice bill is, I think, well-intentioned. I understand why health systems don't want to deal with it, right? They don't want to have to face the music with the public when a change is happening. We went down that with a very smaller scale here in the Capital Region with the Burnett Bird Center, where the system at the time actually jumped ahead of the impending deadline, so they would have to avoid a public meeting. The reality is this. This is my philosophy of being in healthcare for 40 years and my philosophy of being a governor for 26 years. If you, as a provider, whether it's a pharmacy or a hospital, are going to accept public money to be part of your overall operations, then you have to be able to be held accountable when decisions are being made. And quite honestly, if those decisions are being made for the right reasons, it's actually an opportunity to explain to the public where the system is struggling. I think, the hospital systems are going through difficult times. I referenced earlier the 340B changes being proposed by the current president. There's a lot of uncertainty on what that's going to mean, but I can tell you the 340B benefits to hospitals and FQHCs is not insignificant and something that they're concerned about. So I do believe that people say, why did the governor veto it? You'd have to ask the governor. But my gut feeling is with all the impacts of HR 1, this is probably not a time to be putting a lot more mandates on hospitals at this stage of the game. So I think they get a little bit of a pass in this situation.
And you touched on some of this issue, which is in these next piece of policy measures I'm going to ask about. There's other policy measures related to wholesale prescription drug importation and drug manufacturing that haven't made it through both chambers. They passed the Senate, but didn't get out of Assembly committee. Can you help us understand, why they aren't making it through Assembly and what you think needs to happen to get them further along?
So wholesale drug importation, it's a great idea. And basically, one can only look to Canada as the example, where basically what we would be able to do is pharmacies would be able to have relationship with wholesalers in Canada to import drugs. And those drugs, in many circumstances, but not all, are less expensive. Technically, if the health plans covered it, which they may not because they'd be sacrificing their rebates, which I referenced earlier, but if the health plans covered it, we could see lower patient co-payments. We could see lower healthcare premiums. The challenge with the importation bill, because I've been involved with the sponsor on this, is that in Canada, they import from all countries, some of which are facilities that manufacture pharmaceuticals that are not inspected by the FDA. Now, we could go a whole segment on the FDA and its inspections in foreign countries. Most people don't realize the majority of pharmaceuticals in this world are sourced from China and are manufactured in India. And there is a whole litany of problems with some of the facilities in India. That being said, this is why medications, 9 out of 10, as I referenced earlier, 90%, are inexpensive because they're made in these other countries at a much reduced cost. Personally, I think we should be making more meds in America. We should be incentivizing manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, both generic and brand name, in this country. We used to do this in the 1980s, but that was incentivized through tax incentives. And at the time, Congress back in the 80s decided to disband with that. And this is what's led to proliferation of pharmaceutical manufacturing in other countries but the United States. I would arguably say, and I know some people won't like to hear this, that it's more important to be putting $600-700 million to pharmaceutical manufacturing in this state than $600-700 into the manufacturing film credit. Because the truth of the matter is this: when 9 out of 10 prescriptions, maybe even more, those drugs are sourced from China, who is not a friend to the United States, and India, which sometimes has its relationship strained, we are putting our health in the hands of potential foreign adversaries. And I think that's something that should not be lost in this conversation. We need to incentivize it. We need to be competitive because we also don't want to have increasing prescription drug costs going on. But the whole pharmaceutical industry, it's very opaque. I can tell you as someone who's been in for 40 years. And interestingly enough, the rules and laws of this state and this country have actually furthered that opaqueness. Only because the last 8 to 10 years, really more conservative states like Alabama and Oklahoma and Arkansas have been questioning why drugs are going up more. Finally, New York State is getting on board. We're starting to question it too. And it gets back to the key word of transparency, knowing exactly who is paying what and how much. The PBMs have been so creative. Not only are they getting rebates from the manufacturer, of which some are being passed on to the plants, but we really don't know that to be true. But they're also now doing offshore buying groups in other countries to escape the reach of the United States. So this is big business, and I don't think people have any idea. And it kind of gets down to probably a question you would have alluded to or will ask is, well, why don't some of these things move? You've got multi-billion-dollar operations fighting this. Might be out front, but in the shadows of the halls of the Capitol. That's just the way it works.
And so you've touched on a number of issues that you're going to be focusing on this session. Can you talk about, what I guess your top priorities are on this issue, and how will this approach this year be different in trying to get some of these bills passed that didn't make it across the finish line last year?
One of the priorities has been in regards to what I mentioned earlier about making sure that pharmacies are out of the middle of a battle between PBMs and the pharmaceutical manufacturers. And over this summer, both working with the Pharmacist Society and with my colleagues, we've significantly increased the number of members that are supportive of this bill. And I think that's helpful. I've also worked to demonstrate, to push back against the message from these unknown entities that are going to say that's going to drive up prescription drug costs. That is absolutely false. It's bunk. The reality is, I look at the PBMs, once again, they serve an important purpose. There's no doubt about that. The problem is when it's being used in a predatory manner to drive out competition, when it's used in a manner where we're not seeing the full benefit of the rebates, we don't even know who's benefiting from them, but we are seeing their Wall Street earnings increase by billions of dollars a year. One has to question in the process. And quite honestly, most of their work is done with government partners, and therefore there needs to be transparency. It goes back to my earlier comment. If you're willing to get into the business of dealing with government, then you need to be willing to be exposed to full transparency.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Assemblymember.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And we were speaking with Assemblymember John McDonald.
And for more information on drug prescription affordability in New York, you can visit our website. Again, that's at nynow.org. Next week on the show, we'll be diving into the biggest policies from Governor Kathy Hochul's State of the State address. You won't want to miss it. Well, that does it for this edition of New York Now. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET,